Jesus has gone out of his mind. That sounds terrifying. The Son of Mary, which you read that in English, you don't care. You probably read right past that and it doesn't make any difference to you. Nobody is called son of their mom. It's son of their father. Welcome to Two Truths. I'm Dr. Darren Yamarino, and today we're going to be beginning the first part of what's likely going to be an 8-part series on the Gospels. Now, the purpose of this series is not going to be trying to go through as many chapters and verses as possible. Instead, what I'd like to do is I'm going to highlight areas of the different Gospels that I think are confusing or where there are multiple viewpoints and ways to understand it. Since again, this channel is sort of all about looking at various viewpoints that are out there. All right. So let's get a little background first and foremost on the Gospel of Mark. Why the Gospel of Mark to start out, right? Doesn't the Bible go Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Yes, it does. No, it shouldn't. The reason behind all this is because Mark is actually the oldest. That's the scholarly consensus. So it's probably compiled around 66 to 70 CE. All right. Now, the reason why you have Matthew first is because the older church tradition assumed that Mark was just like a synopsis or shorter summary of Matthew, which is, longer than Mark is. Mark is rather short. The reality is, as we now seem to know, is that Mark came first and that Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark as one of their sort of primary sources. All right. So that's why I'm going with Mark first. I'm going chronologically, essentially here. All right. Now, this is important to understand. If it's written down between 66 and 70 CE, that's a good amount of time, 40 years, basically, give or take, from when Jesus has been, crucified. A lot can happen in a 40-year period of time, right? Even less than 40 years. I mean, look at our day and age, right? How quickly things change. It matters because certain cultural references might be different, and it's very easy to forget or, misinterpret things. Let me just give you a couple quick examples. This is from the 1990s. So anyone watching this who's like, I don't know, I'd say under 30 or 28 or something like that, might not know these references. This phrase, be kind, rewind. What the heck is that a reference to? Well, I mean, that was like a Blockbuster thing where you had to rewind the VHS tapes before you would return them. Now, if you've never dealt with VHS tapes, whatever, you have no concept of this. Another simple example, 1-800-COLLECT, right? A collect call, something like that. You wouldn't understand if I was trying to use a collect call as an example to explain something else. 35, 40 years later, it's like, the reference might be lost type of thing. So that matters when we look at all these sacred texts. Christianity is actually quite lucky because they do have a lot of texts that are pretty early, close to the time of Jesus. If we were to look at something like, say, Islam as another example, we might be talking about a much larger stretch of time before we get a lot of good texts put down. So just an example, something to keep in mind as we go forward. Now, Mark is one of the synoptic gospels. That's a sort of key term that comes up in biblical studies. Synoptic means that you're basically like seeing it all together or seeing with one vision type of idea. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are similar. They're similar in terms of the stories they relate about Jesus. In terms of the way the Gospels are arranged, there's more similarities. The wording and language, stuff like that. It's sometimes known alternatively as the triple tradition. Whereas John, when we get to that much later, is sort of off in its own world, right? It's got a lot of different stuff that's in the Gospel of John. I mean, who wrote it? Who put this down? Who is Mark, right? Well, we don't know. That's the easy answer. Historically, it's attributed that it's like Mark, who's the companion and interpreter of the Apostle Peter. Maybe, but it's just as likely that it's one of the 70. So Jesus had like 70 followers at one point in time before he sort of loses them, according to in the Gospel of John. So it could have been part of this early Jesus movement, someone who was involved. Nevertheless, not one of the 12 apostles, right? So we don't really know. Effectively, it's really an anonymous situation. Right? Someone who was there, who compiled early Jesus sayings, apocalyptic discourses, conflict stories, and a passion narrative of Jesus. Right? So that gives you a little bit of the background. Let's jump in. All right. Let's get into the actual text. Let's start with chapter 1, verse 4. So I'm not going to read the whole verse. I'm going to bring it up here, and then I'm just going to provide the commentary. All right. It's the only way to get through enough of the things. So in chapter 1, verse 4, we have John the Baptist. Pretty fascinating that right out of the gate, we're jumping straight into an adult version. There is no Jesus is a baby type of thing here. We're jumping straight into like kind of the mission and him as an adult. And we've got John the Baptist coming up first. And John the Baptist has a mission. He's very popular at the time, very popular. You have to understand that. John the Baptist is more popular than Jesus by a lot at this time, right? So keep that in mind. Now, John the Baptist has a mission statement, and his mission statement is effectively to call all those people who are missing the mark, you could say sinners, but that's somewhat misleading, but like sinners to metanoia in Greek. Remember, the Bible in the New Testament is written in Greek. So we have to understand what metanoia is. It literally is like his mission statement. 7 out of 10 English Bibles will translate metanoia as repentance. And that is a horrible mistranslation, because the idea when you say repentance is you're immediately lumped into this like human beings are by nature kind of sinful, in need of like should feel guilt and shame because of this original sin or whatever else is going on. There is no original sin in Judaism. Like what John the Baptist is talking about here is like all of us fall short of a optimal ideal way of living, right? And so what he's saying is that he's calling all people to have a conversion, effectively a total transformation of your heart and mind in conjunction. That's what metanoia is about. If we literally break down the word metanoia, which is worth doing, you have meta, which is after or beyond. Like there's also the word metaphysics, maybe, right? Maybe you've heard that. So after or beyond, and then the N-O-E-O kind of part here, if we were to break the word down, kind of like the word noetic, if you've ever heard that used, to perceive or think. So the idea is that you're somehow being able to move beyond your typical form of perception, which is how most of us assume we arrive at knowledge, right? Some empirical approach. So going beyond that, or just our typical rational way of thinking. Right? Sometimes when like thinking has completely run its course, there's like a pause and it stops, and then there's a gap. And in that gap, you are opened up to greater possibilities. So what John the Baptist is effectively saying here is like faith, but faith of a very, very different type. Not your typical Jewish faith, which is rational. Remember, Jewish faith is very rational at this time. It's literally contract based. God said, do this, follow the law, right? We follow the law. God must fulfill his other promises in the contract. That is rational. That's a very understandable thing. John the Baptist and Jesus are talking about something way different, right? They're going to be talking about an intense form of faith, okay? But I'm going to stop it there for now because this is going to come up many, many times, this whole issue of metanoia, because everyone talks about it, whether it's Paul or the other apostles or Jesus, as we'll see here in a second. So let's jump to chapter 1, verse 10, through 10 and 11. You have this baptism story and the dove, classic image, right? Within Christianity too, with the dove descending and all this. And then you've got God saying that effectively, this is his son with whom he is well pleased type of deal. Here's what I want you to understand. A couple ways of looking at this. One, it has been pointed out, at least as far back, probably farther, by Morton Smith in like Jesus the Magician, that there are a lot of similarities in this baptism narrative to the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri in how you become a god, where there's like the descent of a falcon or a hawk that will come down upon like the magician at the moment that you sort of attain apotheosis or like to become godlike. So similarities here to that. Now, that's one thing to look at. A second thing to understand, Gnostic forms of Christianity, which I have another video on that. I don't have time to go into the details of Gnosticism here, but in Gnostic forms of Christianity, there's this idea that Christ is a spiritual being. Jesus is a human man, like flesh and blood, and then Christ is literally a spiritual being. So what Gnostics are going to say is happening here is that the high God is saying, this is Christ, my son, spiritual being, with whom I'm well pleased, who's going to effectively possess the man, Jesus. And then his mission starts. No, Jesus's mission basically starts, bam, right after this. So different ways of looking at it. That's the whole point, right, of the channel. So there's that. Let's move on though and get to Jesus's first sort of words in all of this. This is in 1:15. Basically, all I want to call out here is that Jesus's first words are John the Baptist's words. It's just the same thing. It's like the mission statement is metanoia again. So he's placing himself directly in this line or lineage, if you will, of John the Baptist, basically, right? So interesting. Let's jump. So let's go to chapter 1, verse 35. Here you have an example of Jesus talking about prayer. There's going to be a lot of this that comes up as we move through the Gospels, especially when we get to the Lord's Prayer. That's very illuminating, but that's in the future here for us. Right now, in Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verse 35, we hear that Jesus seeks prayer in dark, deserted places, sort of, right? And he's praying really early in the morning all the time, before the sun is up type of deal. This is something done in Hinduism, by the way, sort of like Brahma type hour for something or whatever in the morning. You do find this in multiple traditions. So I think we have to ask ourselves, why? Why not just pray at 8 a.m., or 10 or whatever it is? There is a good reason for it. The veil is thinnest at this time. It's not that the world is really different at 4 a.m, but let's be real. It's very quiet. So that's a fact. It's dark. So there's less sensory stimulation to pull you out, right? So you can be like centered in within. That's one piece of it. The other piece is that you're probably tired. So you might have what's called hypnagogia, everyone here is watching has had a hypnagogic jerk where like, you're about to fall asleep and like your leg kind of shoots out and it kind of shocks you back into being more awake. It's that very thin boundary, right, between waking and sleep. You can carve out that boundary in meditation or prayer, and it allows you to access more of the spiritual world. So Salvador Dali, the artist, would intentionally try and tap this through getting super tired, holding a big metal spoon and like holding it like his elbow on his knee over a big metal platter on the ground. And so as he's falling asleep, eventually he's going to fall asleep, right? He's going to drop the big spoon. And then there's this little gap of time before it hits the platter. So when it hits the platter, it's super loud, right? And boom, you're back. It's like the jerk thing, right? You're back to more conscious awareness, and then you paint. It's a way to rip from the subconscious secrets, I guess you could say, or cool art, if nothing else, from it. All right, now let's move into the really crazy stuff here. The last sort of few things for this particular video, part 1. Chapter 3, verse 21. Jesus has gone out of his mind. That sounds terrifying. And it is terrifying. That's why Matthew, Luke, and John don't include it in this manner. Only Mark includes this because it doesn't sound good. It basically sounds like Jesus is having a mental breakdown and his family is the one who they need to come out and fix this problem. So interesting, right? That's in there. Followed immediately by this whole thing with the scribes accusing Jesus of being possessed by a very specific figure, Baalzebul or Baalzebub. It's the, like in Hebrew, you might have the spelling Beel, right? But it's really Ba, like Baal, the term for Lord, but also sort of like the Canaanite or Philistine in this particular case, kind of like high god, or one of the important gods at least, a prince of demons, something to this effect. What they're basically saying, the scribes, is that very smart on the part of the scribes to do this. They could say Jesus is not doing exorcisms. Like it's a lie. It doesn't work. But they're smarter than that. They're saying he is doing exorcisms effectively. The question you, the people, need to ask is why? How can he pull this off? And their answer is because he's possessed himself by the worst of the worst. And that is how magic and demonology functions. If I have the highest demon, within me, I can dictate and tell lower level. It's like the military. I can tell, I'm a general. I can tell all the lower, ranks to leave or do whatever I want. That's why Jesus is so effective in his exorcism. Now, Jesus is going to reply back and be like, how could Satan drive out Satan? Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, they're the ones possessed, not me, right? And I have an even higher authority, right? The true God type of thing, right? So, interesting account. But notice the scribes are trying to discredit him here in his adult mission. Now, we're going to get very soon here to something else that's sort of problematic in terms of discrediting Jesus, but that's coming up in a minute. If we look at chapter 4, verses 10 through 12, I don't have a lot to say here, but I just want to highlight it and bring it up on the screen because you have a crystal clear statement that Jesus's true message is hidden. It's cryptic, basically, right? Like you have to unpack it. And even his apostles rarely, if ever, seem to get it, which frustrates Jesus all the time. So he's speaking in parables, right? He's speaking in riddles. It's not always super obvious what he's getting at. In chapter 4, verse 34, there's even more evidence of this like esoteric versus exoteric situation. Okay. There's some interesting stuff that happens in chapter 5 that's sort of famous. Like in chapter 5, verse 6, we've got another demon-possessed man. There's always demon-possessed people in Mark. Jesus is struggling, though, here with this one. And it's bizarre, the whole like interaction. Like the demon-possessed man tries to invoke God for protection, which is weird. If Jesus is supposed to be God incarnate, as opposed to being possessed himself by some demonic entity. So there's that going on. Then we have in 5:9, Jesus is struggling to effectively deal with the demons. And so he has to ask for the name. This is classic for exorcisms, right? You need to get the name so that you can exert the hierarchical sort of power authority. And then you have this name given that's bizarre, Legion, right? Legion, because we are many. There's a ton of them, a ton of demonic spirits in this guy. Now, that's the literal reading. I bring this example up because, look, you have a Greco-Roman lens we can look at this through. There's a magical lens. There's a Jewish lens. I mean, and probably others that aren't popping to my head at the moment. So you need to be able to put on different pairs of like glasses when you read these texts to get the majority out of it. So like when you hear Legion, you can look at it on a demon magic thing, fine. But let's look at it through a Roman lens. The Romans are the enemy of the Jewish people. The Messiah is, supposed to overthrow physically get the Romans out. So there's no longer this sort of occupation. And it's kind of like the Bible saying, like, okay, Jesus could, if he wanted to, overthrow all of the Roman Empire, as a legion, because there's legions of Roman soldiers that have like 5,000 men in it. But interestingly, instead he like takes it and there's like 2,000 pigs and casts them into the pigs. Once again, pigs are unclean animals. There's that. But pigs are associated with the Roman military. They eat a lot of pork and stuff. So there's a whole bunch of stuff happening there and how you can look at it through that lens. And maybe they're trying to say like the kind of Messiah type elements of it. But it's a weird story because in the end, the people are not thankful for whatever he achieves here. And they basically ask him to leave. So kind of a strange encounter, right? Now, last couple things here for today. In chapter 6, we get to this point where he's in his hometown, and you struggle in your hometown to ever achieve what you want. But he's referred to here in chapter 6 of Gospel of Mark as the son of Mary, which you read that in English, you don't care. You probably read right past that and it doesn't make any difference to you. Nobody is called son of their mom. It's son of their father, always. In these more patriarchal type, right, situations. The only time you say son of Mary, let's say, in this case, is if the paternity is in question, really. I mean, that's kind of the deal. Now, the Bible's saying, yeah, sure, the paternity is in question because it's God, right? That sort of overshadows, to use that term or whatever it is in Greek, overshadows Mary and she gets pregnant, right? So that's one way to look at this. Another way to look at it is that, again, you've got like the scribes and Pharisees who are against Jesus. And it kind of sounds like they did call into question the paternity here. In fact, they're going to even claim that, it's Pantera. It's a Roman soldier. It's not Joseph, certainly not God, that's really what's going on. So it's an interesting thing how you need to, again, understand the cultural context. In English, 2,000 years later, you read right past that and it's just whatever. Last thing for today, okay? I want to wrap this video up. In chapter 6, verses 7 through 12, you have the apostles who are going to be charged even with bringing about sort of metanoia. All they need, though, is this spiritual authority transferred to them and a staff like Moses or something, right? They don't need money. It's very clear. You do not need money. You do not need to have multiple items of clothing, a whole bunch of food or something with you. Nothing like that. So this is just one of countless examples we'll see moving forward where the American prosperity gospel doctrine especially is absurd. I normally don't come down on one side or the other, but I absolutely will hear the prosperity gospel is garbage. It has no basis in Christianity. It has no basis in Jesus's message or any real historical aspect to this religion, right? It's a charlatan's game, unfortunately, to try to con people. And that is just what it is. And we'll see more and more of that as we move forward. For now, that's it. Please listen in and look forward to part 2 that'll be coming down the pipeline here soon. All right. Till next time.